Hi everyone. So yeah, my talk today is going to be about building PayPal into cross-domain components. This is really just going to be about how we took our experience and how we try to make it a lot more seamless inside our merchant pages. Some of the technology we used to get there and kind of the direction we're going. So my name is Daniel Brain. I've been an engineer on the checkout team for about 3-4 years now. And every day I find myself coming up against interesting new challenges, so I'm loving every second of it. So yeah, what am I going to talk about today? Firstly, I'm going to go over a little bit of a history of what are components on the web. What even is this concept of a component? I'm going to go into our kind of grand plan for cross-domain components, how we take components and bring them onto other domains and merchant pages, how we got there, what we open sourced along the way. We have a few modules to share with you, and where we're going next, what our grand plan is for this whole movement. And of course, a fair bit of ranting about Internet Explorer because I feel like I've suffered enough. I ought to have a little bit of a rant. So what's even the deal with components? If you've done any front-end development over the last 3 or 4 years, you'll know all about this. Turns out components are a really good way to build stuff on the web. This really is kind of the latest and greatest. And actually, this has been the case since long before frameworks like React came along. You can really trace the evolution of components back to when the first person wrote the first reusable CSS class. Back in the dark days when websites were a mishmash of HTML and global CSS, someone thought, oh, I'll write a reusable class, and now I have something resembling a little visual component that I can share and reuse, and other people can reuse too. After that came this great framework called Bootstrap Css. We started sharing, a big collection of reusable visual components, buttons, forms, the works, and everyone started buying into this movement of using reusable kind of abstract CSS. That's great for the visual side of things, but then Backbone.js came along with its concept of views, and now everyone's buying into the idea of components with kind of custom behavior. So I can have this kind of nice isolated component with a bunch of event handlers, a bunch of styles, and it's all kind of self-contained in one place, and it's nice and reusable, and it's kind of now more resembling a custom HTML element with its own behavior. And kind of the final icing on the cake are the wealth of frameworks we have these days for components. Ember has a component. Angular has its directives, which can be used as components. Polymer, obviously, for creating kind of your custom HTML elements. And React is kind of the pinnacle of components these days. It's really set in stone what a component should look like on the web. And of course, now web components are even part of the HTML specs. These are really here to stay. This is something that's not going away. So what have we learned from components so far? Well, firstly, I think it's that building good interfaces is a really important thing. Having isolated little parts of our web apps that have their own interfaces, they can be separately tested. They have some kind of data down, actions up paradigm going on, which React has kind of popularized a lot, which really means that I can treat components now a lot like I treat functions in functional programming, where I have an input and an output, and hopefully not too much state in between. And I really like the direction React is going with that. The second lesson we've learned is that managing state is something that we obviously have to do. Now we're all writing stateless server-sides and REST APIs. A lot of our state has been pulled down into the client, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. But it's worth taking really seriously how we manage that state. Typically, in the dark old days, people would put a lot of state in the DOM. Then people started realizing, oh, we can use JavaScript objects and render our DOM dynamically from those. Then people started thinking, well, let's keep our state localized to components. And of course, React has come along now with this Redux pattern, which allows us to actually share state between components in a kind of more manageable way. But the important point is that it's worth really thinking carefully about, and you cannot start building an app these days without worrying about your front-end state. And of course, encapsulation and namespacing. Now we're starting to think of components as discrete chunks of our web apps. We no longer have a big templates folder and a big CSS folder and a big controllers folder with all of our different things separated out. We can actually bundle those things together and encapsulate what a component is in one place, and even include our tests in there as well. And the idea is that a component should be this one bundle of reusable, isolated stuff that people can then look at and they can see everything that it's going to do all at once. And yeah, we made a bunch of mistakes getting there, of course. A lot of components jumped on the two-way binding bandwagon, where I'd have data that was kind of synchronized dynamically from component to component to component. And yeah, it's great when you have a demo, but when you start building a big scale app, it starts really deteriorating, so not such a good idea. Mega controllers were a thing for a while. People were writing JavaScript controllers that encompassed a whole page and not really breaking anything up into components, and that breaks down, obviously, after a while. And I guess there's no excuse these days to use anything short of a really good bundler like Webpack. So, you know, just in order to get everything included, import CSS and import your templates without having to bundle those in separate locations. So yeah, I think mission accomplished. Web components, they're great. We're in a really good place. But kind of not quite, right? What if we want to have a component that works cross-domain? What if I want to share a component from PayPal that we're going to use on one of the hundreds of thousands of merchant sites that we support? Well, now I have a problem. Merchant sites could be built in any technology. I don't necessarily want to force them to load React or Angular or Ember. And I also have a lot of concerns, you know, with data security. I can't just arbitrarily pull data down into a merchant site. So we've got to think about this really carefully. You know, the moment we start trying to write cross-domain components, we end up with a big problem. Iframes everywhere. So let's ask the question to begin with. What even is a cross-domain component? I've used this term a lot so far. But it sounds like you probably deal with these things every day. You know, the Facebook comment widget is a cross-domain component. It lives in other people's domains in an iframe. PayPal has a cross-domain component. Our checkout flow you can load into a merchant page in an iframe without ever leaving the merchant page. And even things as simple as YouTube embedded videos, I would class as a cross-domain component. So right now, the way these kinds of things live, they're using very kind of these browser primitives that enable you to just embed sites like iframes and pop-ups and some post messaging to communicate between all of these things. But the problem with these things is they're primitives, but they're kind of primitive. It's very difficult to really use an iframe in a meaningful way other than just loading something onto your page and letting it do its thing. You know, pop-ups, difficult to open the things in the first place. You can only do it on a click event. They're not fast to load. You have to make another round trip to the server to get these things to even load in the merchant page. Some browsers are going to force them into full page mode, looking at you, Internet Explorer again. And there are a lot of problems running code in a parent window and scheduling that code while you have a child window open. So pop-ups, not great as they stand in browsers. Iframes are also kind of lame. These things have been around for a while. Everyone kind of hates them. They're a bit slow to load. Normally you just use them to embed some other site. It's not usually a very fast or nice experience. And post messages, kind of the most neglected of the lot, especially in Internet Explorer. They only allow the most basic serialization, serialized data to be passed across here and there. They're 100% fire and forget, which makes things really difficult. If you're trying to send a message from one parent component to a child component, you don't know if that message ever really got through. There's no way to know, unless you write a lot of additional logic. So yeah, so good luck handling any errors there. Literally, post message will never throw an error. And of course, our friend Internet Explorer won't even let you send messages between a parent window and a pop-up. So unless you're using iframes, you're kind of screwed. So our first attempt at building cross-domain components was a couple of years ago. We had a kind of integration script that we put on merchant pages. And it used iframes, and it used pop-ups, and it used post messages, all in a kind of very basic way. But yeah, the years have not been kind to this thing. So, you know, after a lot of feature creep and not a lot of love, it's ended up not being the most maintainable script in the world, as is common, you know. It uses a lot of hacky things to support our legacy PayPal integrations, which were just buttons sending full-page form submits. So obviously we wanted to get away from some of that legacy craft. We wanted to get away from rendering too much stuff directly onto the merchant page, both for security reasons and because when you have your own code running on someone else's site, and there are thousands of these sites out there that use this script, obviously there's a potential for your code to conflict with theirs, so not a good situation and a lot of time wasted having to support this thing. So how do we fix it? Where do we go forward from this old script? So my approach is let's take what we've learned from components. Let's learn all we can from React and even Angular and Ember and so on, and figure out how do we actually build things into a component-oriented approach that's going to be a lot more stable and bug-free and hopefully faster. So our first thinking was let's build some better abstractions around these browser primitives. Let's make them better, right? There's no reason why we can't. Let's encapsulate as much logic as we can on our own domain. Iframes and pop-ups are great because they have their own window context. You're not going to screw with your parent page if you have logic running in an iframe, which is great. And let's figure out, finally, a way to create a really good interface. You know, we want to get away from just doing full-page redirects and full-page redirects back to merchant sites. We want to get away from these fire and forget post messages, you know, that we don't even know if they've landed correctly. We want to create a really good interface for our components that people are going to be integrating. So we came up again, with a big list of problems we wanted to solve, and the first one that we thought we'd bite off is post messaging. So we came up with this module called PostRobot, and this actually starts treating post messages in a kind of client-server pattern. So now I can actually send a post message, I can get a response, and I can handle any errors, which is really important. If the window that I'm messaging is closed, I'm going to get an error. If the window doesn't respond in time, I'm going to get an error. If it doesn't send an acknowledgement, I'm going to get an error. So I know for sure now my message has got through, and if it hasn't got through, I can do something about it, which is great. It works around Internet Explorer's quirks, so it actually enables me to message pop-up windows, which is an absolute must, at least for PayPal's use cases. And of course, it supports interfaces like promises and async await, which I think is really a must in any modern JavaScript kind of API. And finally, it supports slightly more complex data types than just serialized objects. Actually, with PostRobot now, I can pass a function down into a cross-domain component that's on a totally different domain, and it's kind of like I'm giving that component access to my function. Like I can expose a little bit of functionality here and there by passing down functions without having to make that child window explicitly set up its own listeners and all that kind of boilerplate. So an example of that is I might set up this listener to get user. I promise there won't be too much code today. It's exposing this logout function. So it's passing a logout function to the other domain. And then that other domain can then call logout as if it was calling it on the original domain. So it's kind of bridging the gap between these two domains, but it's only exposing the small amount of functionality that I want to expose. So it kind of remains pretty secure in that way. So problem 2, logging. We want to know what's going on our client side. And a lot of people take this so for granted, it's depressing. The most I ever really see is people having a window on error handler, which sends a beacon off to the client, to the server side. It's just really not good enough anymore. We want to know everything that's going on our client side, and if you don't know that already, then you're missing out on a whole lot of potentially useful data. So we came up with this module called Beaver Logger. It buffers logs on the client side, so it's not sending off a billion requests and making your page site speed suffer. It flushes them in intervals, and it also collects performance stats. So that's really useful now. Now we can log anything we want on the client side, and there's a high chance we'll actually have access to that data later. So yeah, even if you don't use this, I'd encourage you, look into client-side logging. It's really important. So the third problem that I already mentioned was creating a good interface for all of this. We wanted to be able to do the same kind of thing as React. So we wanted to be able to do data down, actions up. But obviously, it's cross-domain, right? So it's a little bit more of a difficult problem to solve. So we came up with this module called XComponent, which actually lets me create a kind of cross-domain component, and it uses PostRobot to pass down all of the data that component needs, including callbacks, because remember, PostRobot now supports functions. So I can have this nice React interface where I pass down functions, and I get callbacks back, and it feels like I'm totally native, even though it's really running an iframe or a pop-up. So I have this like little spec. This is a PayPal button, simplified example, but I'm setting up some props, some payment options, and an on-payment complete callback. And then when the user or the merchant wants to integrate this component, they simply do a render. They pass down their options, their data. They pass down a callback, so we can get actions up, just like React. And all the while, I'm never having to deal with iframes. I don't actually have to manually create anything, and I don't have to worry about setting up any post message listeners because that's all taken care of for me. So it's a really kind of like native approach to cross-domain components. The fourth problem was integration. So this is great. We have a nice interface now, but how do we actually help people integrate this thing? Obviously, all of our merchants are using different technologies. Some are just using very basic HTML. Others have the most up-to-date single-page apps using React or Angular or Ember or anything else. So we want to be able to support all of these guys, right? And the way we did that was to build this compatibility layer into XComponent, which actually kind of creates little drivers for different frameworks. Turns out to not take a lot of code to do this. So if it detects React is on the page, it's going to create a little React component that I can use. It's going to let me drop down my options in React, my callbacks as a React property, and all the while I feel like I'm using a React component, but actually it's rendering an iframe. But I never have to really be aware of that fact as the merchant who's integrating this thing. And the second example is an Angular component, but really it's possible to build these bindings for any framework that our merchants say they're using and want support for. So yeah, problem 5, rendering up. This is probably the most kind of complicated problem we had to solve. We have a lot of situations where we want to render a component in an iframe, but we want that component to be able to render another component in the parent page. An example of this is just as simple as the PayPal checkout button. You've probably all seen this at one point or another. So when you click on this button, it's going to open up a lightbox. And these two things are two different components. The way we're gearing this up is the button itself actually lives in an iframe, and it has to message up to the parent page to tell the parent page to render this second component. And the way we do this means that it doesn't have to expand the iframe to take up any more space than it needs to. It just loads an additional iframe on the page, which means that I can really kind of compose my cross-domain components a lot more easily, and it feels a lot more like they're natively there on the page. And another quick example of this is where this is just a proof of concept button with a little drop down, and actually we can break this into two different components so that we're only rendering what we need to as we need to on that parent page, and it's all still cross-domain. So all of that data is still protected and sandboxed and safe. So yeah, this is the solution. XComponent comes with this render to parent method that lets me really easily chain together components and render up and render sideways and all sorts of stuff like that. And it deals with all of the problems that come with that. You can imagine that there's a lot of messaging involved, and doing this manually is a huge pain, especially if you're dealing with pop-ups as well, because now you have to start thinking, oh, I only have a click event in my iframe, so I can only open a pop-up here, but then my parent has to render an overlay, and it all gets very, very complicated, but XComponent actually deals with a lot of that orchestration for you. So problem 6, IE quirks. This is my IE rant. There's a lot of problems in IE when you try to render a pop-up and you try to do something in the background window while that pop-up is focused. It turns out if you use any set timeouts at all in your parent page, IE just says, OK, that's it, I'm done, I'm checking out. I'm not going to run your code anymore, which is obviously not very useful when you're trying to message back up, when you're trying to kind of run code on both domains at the same time through post messaging. So it turns out everything else, any other async API like AJAX calls or post messages work great. It's just set timeout. So we actually had to cut out all of our set timeouts, including, for what it's worth, in promises. If you ever use promises, you'll know that they're 100% async. They use set timeout in the browser. So we had to write our own little promise implementation that did not use set timeout just to get around this. Another problem that I already mentioned, you cannot post message an IE between two windows, so between a parent window and a pop-up. So we actually have to create a little iframe on the same domain as the pop-up just in order to message up to that pop-up. There's no other way to do it. But thankfully, PostRobot, the module we created, actually abstracts a lot of that away. So if you're looking to do that, it's a really simple way to do it now. The seventh problem, I mentioned already the speed of this thing. Iframes and pop-ups are not fast, especially if you're rendering them immediately onto a page. You have a round trip for the initial page render. You've got to load the JavaScript. Then you can render this iframe, and then that does another round trip, and maybe it loads some more resources. So these things end up being really slow, and it's kind of janky, and it's not an experience we like our merchants to have. So Xcomponent actually lets you render an initial component into that iframe or into that pop-up just immediately after the page loads. And this has a really nice, even if it's just a fairly static template like a spinner, or you can be a little bit more clever, it has a nice effect on the user, and it gives them the impression that something is happening and they're not just staring at a blank box for 10 seconds. So the end result, Xcomponent gives you all of this nice functionality. You no longer really have to worry about the differences between iframes and pop-ups. That's kind of abstracted away a little bit. I can pass down callbacks and data as if I was rendering a native component, even though it's not native, and as if I was on the same domain, even though I'm not. And I can keep a really tight interface while I'm doing this, rather than having post messages flying all over the place and URLs and all of that other stuff. And finally, I can expose components now that my customers can integrate with. No matter what they're using, no matter what technology they're using, they can just drop this stuff in. They don't have to learn our SDK. They just get a nice native feeling component for their framework. So yeah, these are the modules that we have. Please take a look and raise some issues. PostRobot is obviously the post messaging library I mentioned. Beaver Logger is client-side logging, and Xcomponent is the kind of amalgamation of all of this client-side cross-domain components. So I'd really like to thank Mark and Vishaka from my team for getting all of this stuff open sourced. That was a big effort on our part, but it's all out there now. So thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for listening.